Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to the 14th Annual Murray Bob Lecture. I'm Tina Scott. I'm the director here at the Prendergast Library, and this lecture is funded from an endowment created in the memory of Murray L. Bob, who passed away in 2003. And tonight we have with us Murray's widow, Renee Bob. She's in the first row. Thank you for coming. And Renee and I work on this every year about what would be a great topic to have. So this series was really established to bring speakers into Jamestown to talk about issues that are important to our community. And this year we worked with the Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy. And so here to introduce our speaker is John Jablonski, Executive Director of the Watershed Conservancy.
Thank you, Tina. The Chautauqua Watershed Conservancy's mission is to preserve and enhance the water quality, scenic beauty, and ecological health of lakes, streams, and watersheds of the Chautauqua region. CWC diligently pursues this mission so that the Chautauqua region will remain an attractive, healthy, and enjoyable place for those who live, work, and visit the Chautauqua region now and in the future. I'd like to thank the Prendergast Library and Mrs. Bob for hosting this lecture and for their interest in this topic, which is so important to the health of Chautauqua Lake. I'd also like to thank the Chautauqua County Department of Planning 2% Occupancy Tax Funding Program for its support of the CWC coordinating this and other watershed education and outreach efforts. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Greg Boyer, traveled all the way here from Syracuse after teaching until noon today. Dr. Boyer is a professor of biochemistry and director of New York's Great Lakes Research Consortium at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. He received his BA degree in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley and his Ph.D. degree in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin. After postdoctoral fellowships at the Plant Research Labs at Michigan State University and the Department of Oceanography at the University of British Columbia, he joined the Faculty of Chemistry at SUNY ESF in 1985. Dr. Boyer's expertise is with toxins and other compounds produced by marine and freshwater algae. He was director of NOAA's Great Lakes project to develop monitoring strategies for toxic blue-green algae in the lower Great Lakes and currently assists the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation with their Citizen Lake Assessment Program with algal issues. He has authored over 130 publications and is an advisor to the International Joint Commission on issues regarding harmful algae blooms within the Great Lakes. Dr. Boyer will be making his presentation and will leave ample time for questions at the end. So with that, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Boyer.
I'm actually very happy to come here, and I'm delighted to come here. One of the nice things about being at a School of Environmental Science and Forestry is we have ample opportunity to get out in the field and go around to various places and talk to different lake associations. And I have to admit, it's always a real education for me because this is how I learn about different lakes. I mean, this is your lake, Chautauqua is your lake, and you know way more about your lake than I know about your lake. So you could give the talk, but unfortunately it was my bio, so I'm going to get to give the talk. But what we really work on in Syracuse is we work a lot on harmful algal blooms, and I'll give you an introduction here. I'll start at the very basics. For some of you it may be review, and then sort of talk through a whole series of different talking points. And hopefully at the end we'll have literally 2/3 of the time available for you to ask questions on various things that you have about harmful algal blooms or Chautauqua Lake. And if I don't know the answer, there's probably somebody else in the room who does know the answer, and we can have a community discussion. And that's where it gets really fun. For those of you who don't recognize the pictures, I threw them up here just so that you realize that you are not alone in having harmful algal blooms. The one guy on the jet ski, that's actually a DEC representative sampling in Grand Lake St. Mary's. The waves at the bottom are Lake Erie. The other two in the middle are Lake Neotwanta, which is a small, shallow lake just north of Syracuse that we've studied for about 15, 20 years. And then my favorite one, the brick there, that's Lake Tai or Taihu in China. That lake happens to be the drinking water supply for 8 million people. So I always throw that up there just so when you think things are bad, just remember that there are other places in the world that have similar problems. Okay, let's see if I hit that. Okay, so I will show a lot of photographs. Some of the photographs will be from Chautauqua Lake. Many of you in the room may have taken the photographs and given them to Doug, who Doug then forwarded them on to me, and I did not give you credit for your photographs. So I'm going to start right off the bat. If you see your photograph up there, thank you very much for your photograph. But I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by a harmful algal bloom or a HAB, why they occur from the 20,000-foot very general view, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Chautauqua Lake, and then I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the best management practices, so I'll go into some of the best management practices and just a general discussion about best management practices and what you can do. And like I say, we'll give some time for questions. For those of you who don't recognize this picture, this was your bloom in 2013, taken from an airplane flying over Chautauqua. All right, so let's start with the general introduction and what we mean when we talk about a harmful algal bloom. It is actually a harder term to define than what you think it might be to define. So let's start, when we talk about a bloom, what we're talking about is a growth of usually algae in the water that grow to a very high density. And so the original harmful algal blooms referred to events that happened in the marine world. And so in the upper corner up there, that sort of reddish picture, that's what's called a red tide. And that was a type of algae that grew in the water, grows to a nice thick density, turned the water red. That particular algae happens to make a very potent paralytic shellfish toxin. People would eat the shellfish. Shellfish would feed on the algae. People would feed on the shellfish. People died. Bang. End of story. And so it was therefore referred to as a harmful bloom. Blooms come in all sorts of colors, and so this is the very nice picture over on the corner there is me looking out my airplane window as I'm flying into San Francisco, flying over the salt ponds, and you can see the different colored blooms in the salt ponds as you fly in. It was very pretty. The middle one is Lake Erie, and then the one over here, for those of you who might recognize it, this is actually another green algae bloom that happened in China. That was the Olympic sailing grounds, and so that was the green algae bloom in the Olympic sailing grounds. Yeah. When we talk about freshwater harmful algal blooms, so harmful algal blooms was stolen from the marine world. So when we talk about a freshwater harmful algal bloom, we're usually talking about what we would call is a blue-green algal bloom. And here it's very easy to get messed up on the terms, and I apologize to it. When I studied phycology, it was easy. We had green algae, they were green. We had yellow algae, they were yellow. We had red algae, they were red. We had blue-green algae, they were blue-green in color, right? Very nice and straightforward. And then somebody actually said, oh my gosh, these blue-green algae, the term algae meant that it was a plant-like organism. They said, these blue-green algae aren't plants, they're bacteria. So, oh my gosh, we've got to change the name. So we can't call them blue-green algae. We now call them cyano, the blue-green bacteria. So we call them cyanobacteria. And so they're now correctly called a cyanobacteria. For me, it's a name. So you can call them blue-green algae. You can call them cyanobacteria. You can call them Fred. You can call them Mike. It's just a name. And as long as we all know what we're talking about, it's not really a problem. However, the one thing you cannot call them is you cannot call them primitive. Right? These organisms have been around for 3.5 billion years. They are at the peak of their evolution. Right? They've had 3.5 billion years to learn how to get things right. Right? So we're still children in their eyes. Right? They're at the peak of their evolution. They've developed things that we dream about. They can put specialized cells inside there. They can make those specialized cells totally separate from the atmosphere, so they can take nitrogen out of the air and use that nitrogen to grow. Right? They can form these big, large colonies, and then they can grow bacteria in the inside of their colonies, so that they harvest these bacteria and they use these bacteria to feed them, so that they don't have to develop all these other things. So they do farming, they do specialized chemical reactions and things like that. They're very adept at one of the things they do. And these actually have practical terms, right? One of the things that they've learned how to do is they use light to grow, just like any other plant. And so they've been very smart about this. They figure that I need to position myself in the water column so that I can get the light that I need to grow. But when it gets too bright for me and the sun is too strong, then I run in the risk of having too much light. So I will allow myself to sink back down in the water column. And they have these little, what are called gas vesicles. That's what the little arrows are pointing there. And they put these little light preservers on, and they will inflate their light preserver, and they will float up. And then when it's too bright, they will deflate their light preserver, and they will float back down, right? It's a very clever adaptation from the algae's point of view. It causes holy havoc from our point of view, because we'll get a report of somebody coming out, and they'll say, oh my gosh, look at this bloom that's sitting out on Canisius Lake. I was out there at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was just all over the lake. Can you come look at it? I get up there at noon. It's high sun. That lake, there's nothing on that lake. It's totally gone. And I said, well, okay, end story. I go home, 3 o'clock, sun goes down, it all pops back up to the surface, right? And the bloom is back. And so one of the important things to remember about these blooms is that because they can control their buoyancy, right, the bloom hasn't gone away because you didn't see it. It just means it moved below, out of the surface, and settled down into the water column. The other thing that these little life vessel things do is they cause it to float on the surface like a bunch of ping pong balls. And it makes it very, very susceptible to wind. And so as they float on the surface, you get a strong wind that blows these things. They'll blow the algae across the lake, and it'll get it to pile up on the downwind side of the lake. Now, if you happen to have a pier or a dock sticking out, and I think most of you have seen that, if you walk out on your dock and you can see where the algae blows up against the side of the dock, or if you happen to be unfortunate enough and live on the, what would it be, the northeast side of the lake, right? And the algae grow up in the lake, and the winds blow off the out of the southwest, and they blow those algae across, and they pile them up on the downwind sides of the shore. All right. Okay. All right. So that's what's sort of a description of a bloom and what we mean by algae. So what do we mean by harmful? Well, again, this is not an easy definition. So I talked a little bit about red tides. That's the little tiny picture I stuck up in there. And for those of you who've been following what's happening in Florida right now, they have a major problem, right? There's no other way to put it. They have this algae, this red tide. This particular algae, the red tide, makes a toxin that I like to call a lawnmower, right? It goes through the ecosystem and it kills everything. All the fish, all the dolphins, all the manatees, the crabs, the starfish, everything. Just amazingly potent toxin. I cannot imagine why you would go down to St. Petersburg, Florida, and recreate at this time of year, because it's just really, really nasty stuff. We don't have that problem, right? Our blue-green algae don't produce fish toxins. But what happens is when you get these very, very thick mats of algae or aquatic plants do the same type of thing, and they start to die, they will settle down in the water column, and then the bacteria will come in and they will decompose that algae, and in the process of decomposing the algae, they use up all the oxygen. And so now I have this poor fish. And this poor fish can be down in the deeper waters where it's nice and cold, but there's no oxygen, and it will suffocate.
or it can swim into the upper waters where it's too warm and it dies of heat stress. Right? It's not a very good choice for a fish. And so when you see dead fish in your lakes and things like that, that's really where they're coming from. They've either died from anoxia, the algae have used, the dying algae have used up all the oxygen, or they've died from heat stress. They've had to go up in the upper waters to avoid those low oxygen conditions, and they can't stand the temperatures up there. Right? And so that's usually when we talk about freshwater algal blooms and fish kills, that's what we're talking about. However, that isn't what grabs the attention in the news media. And so the picture over here is the classic, what we call the Wayne Carmichael dead cow picture, right? And these are the blooms that we really worry about. These are the blooms that actually produce real toxins, right? In this particular case, this is taken out of actually Wisconsin, prairie pothole states. And we'll talk a little bit about it, but if you think about the prairie pothole states, you have these very shallow prairie ponds. You have lots of cows surrounding the ponds, drinking the water. The cows, what cows do, they eat the grass and they poop into the pond, so there's lots of nutrients in the pond. It's nice, shallow, bright sunshine. You get a bloom. If one of those blooms happens to be toxic, and then when the cow drinks the water, we have a problem. I used to think this was primarily a prairie pothole state issue. This picture was taken in about the 1960s, and then I realized the first reported cow death in New York State was in 1932 from cyanobacteria bloom, from blue-green algal bloom. So it does happen in New York State also. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the toxins. I'm a biochemist. I work in a chemistry department. I've written into my contract that I have to show slides with chemical structures on it. Chemistry license. Sorry. So you'll see a few structures, but there's only 3, I promise. Right? So the first one up here, this is the toxin that is the liver toxin. It's called a hepatotoxin. It's called a microcystin, P-I-N, and it was named after the organism Microcystis, PIS, which is the most common organism that produces it, right? It's really not one toxin. It's really like a family of 250 toxins, and like most of these, some of them are very toxic, and some of them are not very toxic, but it's a very big spectrum of these compounds. From a biochemical point of view, it's really cool. And I know you're not biochemists, but trust me, it's really cool. It has a whole bunch of unnormal, not natural amino acids, and it alternates them. So it has a regular amino acid, an unnatural amino acid, a regular amino acid. So all your enzymes that are designed to degrade it, they don't work. It puts it in a circle, so there are no ends for other things to degrade it, to attach to. And so the end result of this molecule is really, really stable, right? And it's really, really hard for it to be degraded by bacteria, by people, by anything, right? One of the practical applications on that is that if you happen to have a drinking water supply and you get these toxins in your drinking water, what you would normally do as a drinking water is you would come out and you say, boil the water. Because if you boil the water, it'll kill all the bacteria. Well, what you have to remember when you're dealing with a very stable toxin like that is if you boil the water, you're going to kill all the cells and cause them to release this temperature-stable toxin into the water. And it's going to be even harder to get rid of it at that point in time. And so you'll see these crazy things saying, well, we're issuing a do not boil advisory, right? It's like, well, but there is a reason for it. It's because when you boil the water, you just make the situation worse because the toxin is very temperature stable. It also becomes very interesting when you try to deal with regulatory guidelines because the way you would determine a regulatory guideline is you do some animal study and you would determine how much toxin it takes to kill an animal. And then you would go back and you would do all these crazy things saying, well, a mouse is not a person, so I'll multiply the number by 10 to be safe. And not all mice are the same, and I'll multiply that by 10 and things like that. And you come up with this guideline, and then you have to figure out how much water you drink. And then you say, I'm going to give a lifetime guideline value. And so that was done about 20 years ago, and they came up with a lifetime guideline value of 1. Well, then the problem happened is we had Toledo come in when they had the big bloom in Lake Erie, and hopefully there's nobody here from the health department, but basically the person at the health department there said, oh my gosh, our numbers are 2.5, we're way above the guideline value, we've got to close down the whole water treatment facility. Not thinking about the fact that the lifetime guideline value basically says you're drinking 2 liters of this water 365 days a year for 40 years before you get to a level that's actually serious, right? Well, US EPA stepped in and they said, oh well, obviously we can't interpret how to deal with a lifetime guideline value, so let's do a 10-day guideline value. I'll just tell you, we don't know how to deal with a 10-day guideline value any better than we did a lifetime guideline value. But anyway, so they said, okay, so we're going to set the number at 1.6. Right? And they have real reasons to do that. And then they said, oh, but children, well, children are more sensitive because they weigh less. And they drink more water relative to weight. So we're going to have a second number for 0.3. So now we have a guideline value. We can't figure out how to interpret 10 days. And we have 2 numbers, and we don't know what to do with, right? And so at least in New York State, which is totally different than many of the other states, they just took this lower number of 0.3 and said, okay, we're just going to use 0.3. If it's above 0.3, we're going to say we have a problem in our drinking water. And then we have 10 days before we really have to figure out what's going to happen there. Right? It becomes very different when you try to figure out recreational contact. Most of us would use a recreational contact of 20. And these came about from some studies. You'll see that number floats around. But US EPA again said, well, no, actually, maybe somebody is swimming for 24 hours and drinking 200 mils of water during this 24-hour swim. And if that's the case, the number has to be 4. Right? And so if you're swimming for 24 hours, you have to really worry about that level. Right? But otherwise, you know, it's just a guideline value. Okay. So these are the liver toxins. And then we have some other really cool things called the neurotoxins. And there's 2 classes of neurotoxins I'll talk a little bit about. One of them is antitoxin, what are called the anatoxins, because they came from a species called Anabina. That was before the name people got involved. It's no longer called Anabina, it's now Dolichospermum, but that's okay. They just changed the name on us to make it difficult. But it's a very potent neurotoxin. It's very different than the liver toxin. First of all, it's very fast acting. So quite often you see the effects like with dogs that actually die on the beach within 2 hours, right? But it's also very unstable. So by the time we get there to sample, the toxin is usually gone, right? Because it probably, in a normal lake, it probably doesn't last more than 6 to 8 hours before it just, under normal lake conditions, deteriorates, right? Similar to the other one, there's a whole bunch of different species that make it, so it makes it really hard to look at your water column and say, oh, this is the toxin we would have in this water, right? And so you're basically stuck having to test for these particular things. And then finally, there's another one here, which we call the paralytic shellfish toxins, which is another neurotoxin. I wasn't going to talk about this one other than I think this one is just way cool also. This is my final structure slide. This is the one that is actually was found in the red tides on marine systems. Right? And this is one of the few natural products that's actually a biological warfare agent. CIA harvested this and used it to shoot on little darts into sheep. You know, it's, the U-2 pilot that got shot down over Russia was carrying a brooch that had a little stick pin of this toxin in the stick pin, and he was supposed to poke himself because there's no antidote to this one, right? Wonderful history, just of all the interesting places you can do with crazy toxins and stuff like that. But it's up there because this toxin is the big unknown for us now, because we really think it's actually quite common in our water systems. But what we think we're finding in our water systems is different
than what's in the marine system. So we're not quite certain how that works. We don't know how to test for it. We don't know how toxic it really is because we know it's on a spectrum and stuff like that. So that's your family of players. So if you go to the internet, you'll find a whole bunch of other ones. But, you know, they aren't really of importance in New York State and stuff like that. There are different ones down in Florida and stuff like that. So here's the sort of the quick summary of that. We have many different types of algae, right? Some of them actually do produce these toxins, but in fact, most of your algae do not produce toxins. These blue-green algae have been around for hundreds of years, right, in your lakes. They're a normal part of the ecosystem. So, you know, we have to deal with the fact that they're a normal part of the ecosystem. We have all these different types of toxins. Some of them we can test for, some of them we cannot test for, or we always can test for, but some of them are very hard to test for. Because of the tremendous diversity, everybody keeps saying, well, can I get one of these little home pregnancy kit for toxins where I stick in my water and I get 2 lines that says my water is safe to swim in? And I can say, absolutely. I can make you a home pregnancy kit for toxins that you stick in your water and you get 2 lines and it will tell you if that one toxin is in your water, but it's not going to tell you if the other 550 possible toxins are in your water. And so that's the real problem that we have to deal with. New York State, the Department of Health basically controls beaches and drinking water facilities, and what they basically said is, okay, this is really getting kind of complex for a beach operator to deal with. So, if the water is green, it's bad. And that's as far as I'm going to go. All right? Green water, bad, close the beach. All right? From a Department of Health point of view, it's very protective. I agree. And if that's your goal, from a beach owner, recreational person who's trying to keep their beach open, right? We've had a number of incidents where they've closed the beach only to realize that, well, there really was nothing of concern there. But, you know, they're trying to be protective of human health, and I understand that. They use a slightly different criteria for drinking water. They actually test for the liver toxins. They don't test for any of the other toxins because they feel that the liver toxin is probably the most common. They are actually investing several $1 million this year to actually bring testing onto some of these other toxins online, the Department of Health. You'd think they would have the ability to do that. Department of DEC actually uses a slightly different criteria. Right? But they say, well, it's not green water that I have to worry about. It's actually the presence of blue-green algae. So they actually separate green water into actually how much blue-green algae is there. And they have a criteria for blue-green algae that they use when they do their postings, when they talk about blooms. All right. So let's talk 20,000 foot. Why do these blooms happen? Because that's what everybody wants to know. Okay. It's really quite simple. They need 6 things, right? They need a source of food, right? But just like anybody else, their source of food is going to be nitrogen, it's going to be phosphorus, it's going to be carbon, but they don't need carbon because they're a plant and they can use CO2 out of the air. And then they're going to need a few other little trace vitamins and stuff like that, but they don't usually have to worry about that because they're really good at making it. Because they're a plant, they need light. It has to be warm enough for them to grow. And because, remember, they have to control their buoyancy and float up and down, they need relatively calm winds, because if the wind is really strong, it will mix them down in the water column and will move them into a position in the water column where they don't like to grow, right? They need a seed population, so there's got to be seeds someplace. Bad news for you and every other lake in the world. Given they've been around for 3.5 billion years, the seeds are there. Right? They're pretty much in every water body, even in Antarctica, even in the Arctic, even in the ice melt ponds on glaciers and stuff like that. And then we have this very interesting thing going on with zebra mussels, right? And grazing and how that impacts the blooms. All right, so those are the 6 things: food, light, temperature,
calm winds or weather, a seed population, and the grazing type of thing. So now the real question is, let's ask the question you really want to know. It's not why do they bloom, but how do I get them to go away? And so now you have to say, okay, well, what of these things can we actually control? Well, we know the seed population's there, right? The zebra mussel issue is a whole 30 minutes on itself. Zebra mussels will feed on blue-green algae just fine. They don't have any trouble eating blue-green algae. Blue-green algae are not particularly nutritious for them, so they need some other vitamins and things like that if they're going to be healthy, but they will feed on it. But they don't particularly like blue-green algae, so if there's anything else there, they will feed on something else first, and they'll just poop it out into the water, and they give all these nutrients which help the blue-green algae to grow. So they can have this sort of dual effect depending upon what else is in the water column and what else the zebra mussel has available for it. But other than saying it's a good thing to keep zebra mussels out of your lake, there isn't much you can really do to use that to control a bloom, right? Well, we have light, we have temperature, and we have calm winds. Well, I'm not going to talk about temperature because there's no way you can throw enough ice in your lake to change the temperature to make it an impact. If you were a golf course, if you've ever driven by the golf course and you've seen these blue dyes they put in the golf course, they put the blue dye in the golf course ponds to block the light that the blue-green algae need to grow. So you could do that if you're a golf course. I don't think Chautauqua is going to allow you to dye the lake blue. Right? So that option's sort of out also. And the calm winds is a really interesting one because you will read about innovative solutions where they try to mix the water up like crazy in order to keep these blooms from happening. I won't say it doesn't work because if you have the right size lake, it actually works really well. But it doesn't work very well on a big lake. Right? So you just can't get enough mixing in a big lake. So what's that do? That brings us back to nutrients, right? It's important to remember nutrients are not the only thing that causes the bloom, right? They have to have all 6 things. So if the summer is too cold, you don't see the blooms. If it's too windy, you don't see the blooms, right? So there are lots of reasons why a bloom didn't occur, right? But when it actually comes to controlling us trying to interfere with the bloom, nutrients are the only thing that we can effectively impact, right? And so you will hear everybody talk about nutrient control, nutrient control, nutrient control. It's not the only thing that's important, right? But it is the one thing we can do. Now, I will say one thing about nutrient control. Remember these guys are at the peak of evolution, all right? If you give them a nutrient in any form, they will use it. Right? If you give them a nutrient as phosphorus, phosphate, right? Laundry detergent, they will use it. If you give them a nutrient as an herbicide that contains a phosphorus, they'll use it. I mean, for them, they don't care that it's an herbicide. They're just going to take the phosphorus out and grow on it. And so you get all these great things in the internet saying, "Oh my gosh, glyphosate, as an herbicide is promoting blue-green algal blooms." Well, it's not that glyphosate is particularly promoting blue-green algal blooms. It's just glyphosate has phosphorus, and the algae just use it, just like they would any other phosphorus source. It also has nitrogen, so they get a twofer. They get both nitrogen and phosphorus out of the same molecule. So they really like it, and stuff like that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Chautauqua Lake. Preaching to the choir here, because I know you know more about this lake than I know about this lake. But I do have access to the CSLAP, Citizen State Water Lake Assessment Program. These are your volunteers like Doug that go out and they collect samples every couple of weeks and they mail them into, I guess they mail them to Upstate Freshwater Institute that runs the nutrient analysis, and then they also send other samples to us that run toxin analysis on these things, right? And they have a very nice database, and you can go on into the DE website and just type in CSLAP and then type in Chautauqua County, and it'll give you your reports for what's happening on the lake. And there's a very nice report card that has pretty symbols that your lake is pretty and it has high user visibility and things like that. But for me, I usually look at the actual data numbers, and so what we're looking at here is the phosphorus concentration in the North Basin and the South Basin. The line here is the 20 microgram or 0.02 milligram per liter line that DEC has said this is the target value for a lake of your type. All right? We can discuss that a lot more, where those numbers come up with. In the blue number here on the South Lake is fairly shallow, so there's only one depth. But you see it's running at anywhere from about 80, I don't work in milligrams, I work in micrograms, so 80 up above 100. Drop down here to 20, but over the last 10 years, it's been sitting around 100, so it's about 5 times the target value. So you got way too much phosphorus in this lake. The upper one up here, you can see the North Basin has a lower amount of phosphorus until around about 1998. Somebody in the crowd will tell me what happened in 1998. It changed the phosphorus levels in the lake. But then the phosphorus levels have gone up, and they're also sitting around 50 to 80 micrograms per liter. These are the phosphorus in the upper water. Interestingly enough, the red lines there are the phosphorus in the deep waters of the lake. They actually measure phosphorus in 2 different places, and you can see the deep waters are actually have a higher amount of phosphorus than the shallow waters, and this is something that we call the internal level, the phosphorus coming off the sediments in deep waters and coming up into the system. However, clearly the total phosphorus is well above the recommended level for this lake and these basins, right? Well, does that actually translate into algae? And so another one of their graphs is a metric that they call chlorophyll. This is the pigment, the greenness in an algae pigment. And you can use that to get a measure of somehow how much material you have here. And you can see here's sort of your target value down around here of about 10. That's where we like to see a lake be. This is the southern lake, and guess what? Your southern lake is green. Surprise, surprise. If you look at the northern lake, I think it's really interesting, and I've looked at this quite a bit. The northern lake, I mean, yes, you're green. You're about twice what you should be on a seasonal average. Remember, this is averaged over the season. Interestingly enough, if you remember the graph before, if I can go backwards, maybe. No. Okay. Oh, yeah, I can go backwards. So remember this one? We talked about this thing being right around the target value on the upper graph of 20 up until about 2000-ish, and then it jumped up. What I find is really interesting is you don't see that in the chlorophyll. Right? So even though the levels were low back in the 80s and the 90s, there still was a lot of chlorophyll in this water. So this is a historically probably pretty eutrophic lake. There's a lot of chlorophyll that's been in this water for quite a while. Okay, those are averages in the middle of the lake. That would be great if you lived in the middle of the lake, but you don't live in the middle of the lake. You live on the shoreline. And now we've got to worry about these winds blowing this stuff in the middle of the lake over to your shoreline. And so what I'm showing here is some of the shoreline values of the blue-green algae for 2017 only. The boxes basically are where half your samples are. And there's 2 take-home messages here. First of all, the amount of variability in the algae on the shoreline is huge. Right? Not to be unexpected, because if you're on the upwind side, it's blowing all the algae away from you down to the downwind side. So the downwind side has a lot of algae on the shoreline. The upwind side doesn't have as much algae on the shoreline. And you can see some of those black slashes, right? these are the sort of, I think that's the average value and not the median value, but the take-home message is the numbers there are much, much higher than you would ever see in the open water. So when you blow this stuff up on the shoreline, you can concentrate this stuff much, much higher than you have to worry about. Now, so we have lots of algae here. The next question is, well, are these algae toxic? Right? And so, first of all, the thing you have to remember is toxic depends on the algae being present, right? And so it also depends on which algae are present. And so there's a huge amount of variability across the lake. And so this is some data from back from 2013. I apologize, Doug, I was just being lazy. I had that figure put up, so I just threw it back up again. I'll give you the 2018 one. But you can see that some places, for example, the clubhouse, the Hind Beats, very low toxicity. Other places, like CLA in that particular year, were very high toxicity. It's more interesting to me is actually looking at what's happening as the trends over years. Because you can see this was that 2013 bloom, and then we had a lot of toxic blooms. And it's been sort of tapering down as we go on. Now we still get these outliers, these dots. Those are just single samples that are out of the norm. And this is only half the samples, so there are some samples that fall in here. But interesting is that it seems like the toxicity of the lake is going down if you're actually looking at the toxicity. Not the amount of blue-green algae. You've still got a lot of blue-green algae, but it's going to a lower toxicity form. And that's one of the things that we really find fascinating about this lake and why I'm so interested in it, right? The other thing that I find really interesting is this, unlike many of the lakes, remember we talked about the different types of toxins, the neurotoxins and the liver toxins? You're a one-toxin lake, right? You have virtually none of the neurotoxins. And this is cheating. I threw 3 different graphs. These are all the same data, right? Just to confuse you. If I would have graphed it the same way I graphed the figure before, this would be what it would look like, right? The neurotoxin levels on this lake are just extremely low, right? If I futz with the axis and I do all sorts of crazy log axes and make it more linear, I can get things to spread out. But it's very interesting, you see the trend as it's coming down. So we see the same type of trend that we see with the liver toxins. We still have a lot of biomass there, but we seem to be shifting towards a low toxicity biomass, right? All right, I don't know why. I'll just say that. So if you can ask me the question, why is that happening, I don't know why. I can guess, but I really don't know. So the issue is you have a phosphorus-limited lake, or a phosphorus-rich lake. That is leading to additional algal blooms, and, by the way, also leading to increased submerged aquatic vegetation, right? And that's causing your decreased water quality, recreational enjoyment, and potential health impacts. All right. So I wish I could say I had a magic bullet, I could snap my hand, and the lake will be blue. Right? Short of dumping in a blue dye, I can't do that, right? But you have to implement what are called best management plans. So you've all heard the term BMPs. I want to say 2 things about BMPs that I want you always to keep in mind. BMPs are local. So what works in Syracuse may not work in Chautauqua. And you see this all the time, and hopefully there's no, I don't want to offend anybody from the Soil and Water and Conservation District if they're here, but you see this all the time when you start trying to do outcomes from these things. I put a swale in. We ran into this problem in Lake George. And you say, great, is it working? Well, it's removed 60,000 pounds of phosphorus. And it's like, really? How did you come up with that number? Well, I know from what the USDA tells me that if I put in 1,000 feet of swale, it will remove, 500 pounds of phosphorus. And I said, oh, that's great. Where did they get that number? Well, they did a whole bunch of studies on cornfields in Nebraska. And so I say, I understand the problem. So you put a swale in a forested ecosystem in the Adirondacks and use the calculations from a cornfield in Nebraska to tell you how well this thing is working. Right? The thing to remember about BMPs is they are local. Right? What works in one place may be great, or it may not be great in your place. The other thing about BMPs that I always find interesting is there is always a balance of what happens. Right? It is very easy for me to go to the farmer and say, you need to put a 100-foot buffer strip on your property because it is going to clean up the lake. But the problem with that approach is the farmer is the one who's losing the land and losing the income. The homeowner is the one who's reaping the benefit. And so there is always this balance. If I try to push the environmental benefits too strong, right, the farmer pays the price. I can say, gosh, you know, you have a house along the lake, it's very easy. What you need to do is plant 40 feet of trees, preferably pine trees, right along your lake shore. It'll protect your lake great, right? But many of you bought houses because you wanted a view. You didn't want to stare at pine trees, right? And so you have these societal trade-offs that you're always trying to balance with BMPs. And that's where it becomes really interesting. Sometimes it's clear, it's obvious that everybody wins, and then we're all happy. But in fact, in most cases, everybody doesn't win on any BMP. All right, so on the plus side of the lake, you have two really good things going for you. First of all, I know you may not like your TMDL, but you have a TMDL, right? And the nice thing about having a TMDL, right? First of all, for those of you who don't know what a TMDL, it's called the total maximum daily load. It tells you how much phosphorus comes from various parts into your lake. Things to remember about TMDLs, there are two absolutes. A, they're wrong. And B, they didn't measure anything, right? It is all done by models, approximations, and guesses, right? But their guesses are a lot better than the person who's guessing without any information. And so you can use that guess to guide what you need to do. The other thing that's really nice about the Chautauqua area is you have predominantly a forested landscape. You have a lot of agriculture, but you have a lot of forests. Forests are good things. I have to say that, by the way, I work for a forestry school. That's another one of those. Check off. All right. Okay. So here is, I don't know how many of you have seen your TMDL. I mean, it's a big, huge document. Look at the pretty pictures, skip everything else. That's really the way I look at it. But here are two of the pictures out of your TMDL. Right? You can get it off the web, very easy. North Basin, South Basin. And it talks about where it thinks the primary sources of phosphorus coming into these two basins are. And I'm going to go through this just in a little bit so you have some idea of some of the areas that you can focus on. So this is the North Basin, right? Wetlands and forests, right? Up here. Note that the phosphorus coming from wetlands and forests, as calculated from their models, is very low. Good thing. Forest, good. Right? You have agriculture up on the top, hay, pasture, and cropland. These are things that where the phosphorus is running off the soil and coming in. That's calculated by looking at what type of land use is happening, how much rain is falling on that land, and what's the slope of that land, how steep it is, right? So they're not measuring phosphorus. They're measuring rain, slope, and use, and using values derived from Nebraska to figure out what's happening here, right? Right. So we know they're wrong, but they're still useful, right? They're still useful, right? We have point sources. Back when this was done, there were still 13 wastewater treatment plants that were in the North Basin that were discharging. They were actually discharging a significant amount of their phosphorus. And these is actually probably not a guesstimate. Those were probably actually measured values because the wastewater treatment plant would have to report those numbers back that they could get to, right? They have septic systems. I know you don't like your TMDL. Many people have told me this, but I will say that your TMDL did a way better job on septic systems than 99% of the other TMDLs. Most TMDLs for septic systems basically say, oh, here's a house, right? If I take the nationwide average of all the houses on the nation's on lakes, they leak about this much septic. And therefore, I'll just multiply your houses by that number, and that's your contribution from septic, right? At least in this particular case, they actually went into GIS maps, and they said, okay, how many houses are on sewers? If so, they don't have leaky septics, so we can take that out of the calculation. And how many of those houses are within 50 feet of the shoreline? Because if the septic is within 50 feet of the shoreline, the chances of it actually leaking into the lake are pretty high, right? Where if their house's septic is 200 to 300 feet off the shoreline, even if the septic failed, the chance would go in. So they actually did a really sophisticated calculation to figure out what the contribution of these septics were. Now, is it a guess? Absolutely. It's still a guess because they didn't measure anything, but it's a good guess. So we'll give them credit for that one. You have what's called groundwater. This is a really hard one to figure out what it is and how they actually do it. But this is the stuff that enters the lake underground, right? And basically the calculation is you look at the type of soil and you basically figure out how much phosphorus is coming into that subsurface land. You know your soil type. From that soil type, you can figure out what a background level is. And so about 10% of the stuff coming through the groundwater is what's called natural. You're not going to be able to do squat without that. And then you say, well, what about the other 90%? And then you say, well, I don't really know where the other 90% comes from, but it either has to come from developed lands, where it's soaked into the water, or it has to come from agriculture, where it's soaked into the water. And so therefore, since I have about a, looks like a 9-to-1 ratio of developed lands and agriculture, I'll just say that my sub-groundwater comes 90% from agriculture and 10% from developed lands, right? And that's where they come up with that calculation, right? You add that guess to your septic guess, to your point sources, which is measured, to your runoff from your impervious surfaces, those are your roofs and your tiles and your roads guess, to your wetlands guess, to your agricultural guess. You add all those guesses up, you look at what you actually have, and anything else is called internal load. I don't know where it came from, so it must have come from the inside up, right? And so that's how you come up with your internal load, right? For those of you who do TMDL, I'm sorry if I sort of oversimplified the process. So now let's go and look at the one from South Basin, right? First of all, the first thing you have to remember on this one is these graphs are in percents, not absolute amounts. And you got a lot more phosphorus in the South Basin, so even though percentages are smaller, it might actually be the same amount of phosphorus. But in the South Basin, what the TMDL suggests is the cropland is slightly less, the forests are about the same. Actually, the developed land, the runoff from impervious surfaces and roads is much higher. Septic systems is about the same. Point sources was much lower. And you have a huge amount of internal load in the South Basin. This is not actually surprising if you think about the South Basin. It's shallow, it's got a long wind fetch. All that sediment that's sitting down there is going to get resuspended up in the water column. You resuspend that sediment up in the water column and give me 3.5 billion years of evolution, and I'm going to figure out how to get phosphorus right off that sediment and take it out just like crazy. Right? And so you get a lot of that resuspension sediment that comes up. The internal load is a little bit different than the internal load in a deeper basin where you get it released into the deep dark waters. The bad thing about internal load is, honestly, there's not much you can do about it. You can dredge the lake, right? That's very expensive, and it's a very big lake to dredge. You can add alum or phoslock or one of these minerals that lock the phosphorus up and settle it down. The only problem with that is that those don't work in shallow lakes with a long wind catch, which basically says it's really not recommended for putting into the South Basin. Right? You can do something crazy. You can put copper in there and kill all the tadpoles and the algae too. That would do, but I don't think the fishermen would be happy if you did that. And so you're really left with just fix the problem and wait it out, right? Try to stop all the external loads coming in and just wait the process out and wait for the internal load to go. What it's going to do from a practical point of view is it means that you're going to make these changes in the external loads, and they're actually probably going to be working, but you're not going to see that immediate, oh geez, I fixed this, instant gratification because the lake is instantly green, right, or instantly not green, right? Because you have this internal load you have to wait out. Now, I don't want to be Debbie Downer here. I will give you some news from Syracuse, because we did this same type of thing with Onondaga Lake. And the one thing I will say about modelers hate to be wrong, right? And so modelers are very conservative. So they always take a worst case scenario. So in the case of Syracuse, what we said is, look, we have a model what it's going to take to clean up Onondaga Lake. We're going to change the sewage treatment plant, and we're going to invest $300 million, and you're going to be at this level. And then we're going to invest another $100 million, and you're going to be at this level, and then we're going to invest another $100 million, and you're going to be at this level. So you've made a $500 million investment, and the lake will be perfectly clean. Right? And my model shows it going down like that. And you get into the arguments, is it worth it? Is it not worth it? You know, this lake is dead, let's just call it a sewer, and just leave it as a sewer. And fortunately for Syracuse, they basically said, no, let's go ahead and do it. It didn't hurt that they had a court order lawsuit too. But anyway, they decided to go ahead and do it. All right, so they made the investment. Now the problem is, they did the first investment, and the lake got better. And then they did the second investment, and you know what? Their models were too conservative. The lake got so much better on the second investment that they already met the targets for the third investment. All right? And so now you're in this quandary. Do I invest the money to actually bring it to where we should be, and the lake will even be better than what we wanted, or we've met our target, and therefore we're off our case, and so we can just stop it. So that's really the discussion they're having right now. Fortunately, they went the whole way. They just said, okay, look, let's just keep going, and we'll see what happens. All right. The second thing you really have going for you is you have actually a very interesting watershed management plan. It's actually in 3 volumes. You can, again, get it off of the thing. And the reason I find it very interesting is I've looked at a lot of lake watershed management plans, and most of the lake water management plans say, yes, decrease phosphorus from agriculture. And it's like, huh, okay, duh. Now, what do I really need to do? Well, the nice thing about this one is it actually gets down to the creek level. It says, here are 18 management plans. Here's 18 things you can do. Here are specific recommendations that should be done in this town, this town, this town, this town, this town. Here are specific recommendations that should be done in this creek, this creek, this creek, this creek, this creek. There are literally like 200 and some recommendations in this thing when you start adding them all out, because they come out in these big fold-out pages that fold out. They talk about high priority and low priority. They prioritize the whole thing for you. So it really gives you a really good guideline. And just to give you some idea how it looks, for example, this is one of their discussion on individual creeks, right? By the way, higher number is bad here. This is not basketball. So individual creeks and how they rank on these 3 particular things. And you can see it will go and say, okay, our worst creek here is Whitville Creek, And it scored highest because of the percent residential parcels that are not on sewer districts. So if you're gonna put a sewer district in, that's where you should be investing your money, right? And stuff like that. And it goes through that for all sorts of different categories. There's 5 different categories in these 18 different things. So it's a fascinating read, especially if you know where all the places are, because I'm sure you'll read these things and you say, oh, I know where that creek is, and stuff like that. All right. I have to, again, talk a little bit about this. The nice thing about this management plan is it's very specific, but they're based on models that are based on what's happening now. Right? You cannot ignore in your practices the 800-pound gorilla, which is global climate change. Right? Now, we were talking about it there. To me, there are 2 climate change arguments. There's why is it happening? And quite frankly, I don't care why it's happening. I don't care if it's man-made or natural or cycles or episodic events, because I don't care, right? The other one is, what do you do about it? And there you actually have things you can do that can make your system resilient to climate change. And so it's very important to realize that in the Northeast, where we live, you're underneath that big, huge, massive black dot that basically says every climate change model in existence predicts that we are going to have more and more rain. Right? Not that it's necessarily going to get warmer, right? But the lakes are going to freeze over less. We're going to get more lake effect snow in your area. Sorry. You're going to get more runoff, and you're going to get more rain, and those rains are going to come in pulses. Not big, long rains out, but they're going to come as a deluge. The 11 inches we got last year in Skaneateles Lake over the course of the day, right? And then when you get rain that falls that high, right, your best management plan better not be designed for the average 50-year flood, right? Because you will just blow away that best management plan. So as you design these UPs, you have to think about not what's going to happen on the average day, but what's going to happen during these episodic rain events. The other thing about climate change is, and probably going to have way more effect than the temperature ever is that it gets warmer earlier and it gets colder later. Most of your blooms are terminated by the fall cold weather. And so by getting warmer earlier and colder later, you have extended the growing season. So while this bloom might have gone like this and then gotten cold and stopped, it doesn't get cold soon enough. So we start to see our blooms push out not only into October, but they now push out into November. We have a beautiful bloom going now at this time of year. And it's like, DEC stopped sampling 2 weeks ago because they don't have blooms in November, and we're getting these samples that are coming in that have these big, thick fall blooms. All right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some best management plans. I just love this quote. So I threw it up there just because I love the quote. But really, the problem is not coming up with a new ideas. We can come up with 1,000 new ideas. The problem is letting go of the old ideas and actually trying something different, right? Because we are so set in our ways. And one of the ways we're really set in when it comes to best management practices is we want the quick fix. I want to go to the wastewater treatment plant, put in $100 million to fix the wastewater treatment plant, and just like Onondaga Lake, I don't have to deal with anything else. It's done. Goodbye, sign a check. Done. Unfortunately, while you do have some quick fixes you can make, you are the leaky bucket scenario. You got a whole bunch of holes throughout your watershed that are all leaking, right? And you got to go through and patch every one of those little individual leaks. And no one patch by itself is going to be spectacular, Right? And so it's very hard to generate public opinion in those cases because you don't have that big, hey, look, I can take the governor and we can jump in the water and swim across our lake and put a swimming beach on it. You know. The other thing is because all these BMPs are local, right? You don't necessarily know if it's going to accomplish what you want to accomplish it, right? And so you do have to, in some cases, just go out on the limb and try some of these things. But there are some that I think are highly recommended. This is my personal 100% biased view, right? We know that the critical zone for any lake is that 50 feet nearest the shoreline, right? So whatever you can do to protect that 50 feet. Now, I would love to see you plant trees, right? But that's okay. You don't have to plant trees, right? You can put no-mow strips. You can put wildflowers and plants and stuff like that. You can let natural vegetation go in there. But whatever you need to do, you've got to protect that 50 feet because that's where you get the subsurface runoff going over, and that acts as a buffer to catch some of that underground water flow that gets in there. If you're a municipal person, right, if you have control over your town, please do not build a parking lot within 50 feet of the water, right? Because it's a classic impervious surface, right? So try to keep those parking lots back up. There should be no septic systems, you know, so if you have people who have septic systems within that 50-foot buffer, those are the targets for trying to come up with alternatives. And it is, and I'll say this, it's not totally fair to go to somebody and say, you have to fix your septic system, right? You pay the cost. Right? And so there have been some really imaginative programs, like George, that came in and said, look, if we can identify the septic systems within that 50 thing, we will give you a no-interest loan if you will fix that septic system. Right? And so there are some interesting ways, some community development ways that you can go ahead and have them do this. But you want to get everybody to participate because you're dealing with a whole bunch of holes in the bucket. The other one that really needs to be thought is our whole concept of drainage ditches. We put drainage ditches along every single road so that we can get off the water, off the road as fast as possible, and then we don't care what happens to it. And what happens is it comes off that road and it goes zipping right down with all the sediment, nutrients, and everything else. And what do? We then run it into a whole bunch of drainage ditches so it can zip down really fast and carry more sediment and we eventually end up in the lake. Right? Some of this is pretty easy. So your highway department, for example, they like to scrape these drainage ditches so that they can zip down water faster, right? Well, if you think about it, that's exactly the wrong thing that you should be doing. It's okay if you have to scrape the ditch because, you know, we do want the water off the road. We don't want cars to die. Well, we don't care if cars die, but we don't want people to die, right? But you can go in and you can hydroseed very quickly. And you can get grass back in there to do that. You can build little berms. You can put rocks in there. There's all sorts of things that your Soil and Water Conservation District, I'm sure, can give you tons of options. But it's a change in thinking for the New York State Department of Transportation. Right? So this is an area for county that you really need to focus on. Right? I put Rebecca Snyder up there. She's at Cornell University. She is Miss Drainage Ditch. So if you want to know anything about drainage ditches and how to fix drainage ditches, write Rebecca. All right? On the flip side, I'm a big fan of agricultural buffer strips. Right? The idea being that you put some type of strip right along the water, right? You make it a no-mow. The then obvious benefits are, you know, you try to keep the runoff from the field from running into the thing. It allows, you keep the cows out, you know, it promotes stream health. It gives people a place to walk when they want to fish in your stream. It gives all sorts of wildlife habitat and stuff like that. The problem with agricultural buffer strips, and I'll be quite honest with you, is we don't know how wide they should be. Right? We don't know if 50 feet is better than 100 feet or is better than 20 feet. Right? So the 50-foot number was kind of picked out of the hat. You can tell you that. But we like 50. It's a nice round number. It's half of 100. Stuff like them. The other one that's big, and we've done a lot of this, these are actually all from Harbor Brook out of Syracuse, are these artificial wetlands and bioswales. Right? So if you have a high runoff place, right, and you know it's going to carry a lot of nutrients in an episodic rain event, give it a place to go. Right? The idea is if you can slow the water down, and so in Syracuse, we were faced with the option of either building a $120 million big monster underground swimming pool to catch all our sewer, right? Because we didn't have enough capacity in the sewage treatment plant. Or the idea is, well, we don't need to catch the sewer, we just need to stop the water. And so they went to what is called the Save the Rain program, where they looked at all the green infrastructure with the whole idea being, if we can keep enough water out of our sewer, then our sewage treatment plant can handle the lower water. And so we don't have to worry about it. So they went to green roofs to catch rainwater and slow it down. They went to bioswales. They went to rain gardens. They went to green buffer strips in their parking lots and things like that. And in some of the cases where they had these big sewer overflows that they couldn't deal with, they simply built wetlands. So the combined sewer overflow goes into the wetland, and then it allows it to spread out, and it captures all the nutrients, and then it sort of seeps out in the wetland, stuff like that. It's actually great fun if you actually get them where they actually talk about this. They show pictures of, egrets and foxes, and they're building a trail over the top of the thing. Who would build a trail over a sewer outflow? But anyway, they're building a trail over the top, right? They have another version down here where they built the second one, where they basically engineered floodplains, where they say, okay, I have this creek going down. What I need to do is give that water again someplace to go. And so they build, here's my creek coming down, and they built some backups where the water can actually back up and flood these particular wetlands, and then they allow the water to come out as a slope. Now these are big engineering projects. I'm not going to kid you that. I mean, these you have to really invest some dollars, and you have to invest some planning, and most importantly, you have to have a place where it's appropriate. Right? And that's not true everywhere, but it's certainly in blue sky to do that. You'll see streamback stabilizations like this. It's typical, show that as an example of streamback stabilization. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, that's terrible, right? Why is that terrible? Because they kept the soil in place, but what they did is they channelized the stream so the water increases its velocity going around the corner and just erodes even farther down, right? And so the real streamback stabilizations you want to do is you want to do things like this, which are called ecological engineering, where you take old tree stumps and you dump it in, and you allow that bank to naturally stabilize across it. It's a lot harder to do ecological engineering than it is to do just go in and build in bricks and stuff like that. Okay. So, anyway, I've been talking for quite a long time. I think I will stop. So, here's your line summary. In your case, in almost every case, phosphorus is the key. We didn't talk about nitrogen. We can talk all we want about nitrogen, but nitrogen control is very expensive, and usually phosphorus in 99% of the lakes is your target because it's cheaper and it's what's controlling the algae that are growing. And I always say, try to avoid the paralysis of possibilities. Right? There are lots of things you can do. Some of them are big, some of them are little. Right? Just because it's little, don't not do it. Right? So if you can get everybody involved in doing little things, then the sum of little things is a big thing, right? And you can get everything. So almost any BMP, from the local level all the way up to these artificial wetlands, can have real positive benefits. But, there's no silver bullet. It is not going to be one thing that turns the lake around. It's going to be a long haul. I know you don't like to hear it, but somebody has to tell you that. It's going to be a long haul of steady improvement, steady improvement, steady improvement as things get better. Right? And like I say, it's a balance. So try to spread the pain around, try to get as many people involved, And always, don't just blame the farmer, right? All right, I'll stop there and throw it open for questions. Anybody has questions? Yeah.
Current water, in Canada, Georgia Bay, northern Lake Huron, in the last 3 years, they've reported a 95% collapse in the phosphorus levels. And if you're involved in international lakes, I wonder if you've heard about that or had any dream on how that happened.
The Great Lakes are undergoing a very interesting scenario right now. You have a lot of phosphorus coming in from the rivers. You have a shallow shelf. That shallow shelf has a lot of zeros on it. So the phosphorus comes in from the river. It gets incorporated into algal biomass and gets consumed by the zebra mussels that then release the phosphorus back in the nearshore zone. So if I were to go to Lake Ontario, and the same thing is true of Lake Huron, and measure phosphorus within 500 feet of shore, it's running about 60 to 80 eutrophies. If I were to measure phosphorus in the middle of the lake, it's running about 5 to 10. I don't have enough phosphorus in the middle of the lake to support my fish population anymore. So you're getting this disconnect between what happens in near shore and what happens in the offshore. And it's taken us about 30 years to actually realize that that's a real problem we're going to have to figure out how to do that. Because all of our monitoring historically, and CSLAP is the same thing, you went out in the middle of the lake. And that was to be representative of the lake. So all our Great Lake monitoring is in the middle of the lake, but all our problems are on the shores. It's a very interesting problem. Yeah.
Two quick things. First of all, it seems that in any populated area, particularly where they have a lot of buildings and covered surfaces like parking lots, there has to be, must be, a simultaneous pursuit of both sanitary sewers and storm sewers. Because if you don't have sufficient storm sewers, it overloads the sanitary sewers, makes a big farce, a big, huge mess. And I've seen right in Erie, Pennsylvania, where they don't have sufficient storm sewers, and human waste is floating out into the lake because of a huge storm that overflowed the sanitary sewer. And then the other point is in areas all the way from slightly south of the institution, Chautauqua up here, and Jamestown, Lakewood, there's no sewer. But those areas are heavily developed with trailer parks right on the front properties with deficient ancient septic tanks and a desperate mess that's creating. And then how you can say, as you said, that those property owners shouldn't be responsible for that. I mean, I swear, it's their human waste for decades that's been coming in, and others. Who else is going to bear the cost of that? They've been getting by for decades, polluting the water. And that flows over with the wind, west of the wind, over to Venus Point, and just causes catastrophic problems.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that they shouldn't be responsible for it. What I really said is that you need to help and facilitate their response to that. So that's very different. And like I say, let's deal with two questions a little separately. So do you guys have combined sewer systems here? No. No, or you're separate sanitary?
In Jamestown.
There's no significant storm sewers.
The city of Jamestown has a combined system.
You have a combined
Separate.
So the way, so just classic non-engineering description of a sewer system. So I have a sewer system like this, and it's got a little trough down the middle. And when I have all my sewage goes through, there's not much water in this system, so it runs down the little trough, and it goes into my sewage treatment plant, which then treats my sewage, and everything's happy, right? What happens on a combined sewer overflow is the philosophy in the 1950s was dilution is the solution to pollution. So if I have a lot of rainwater coming down that sewage treatment plant, it just flushes out that little trough. And I would like to say I captured that rainwater in my sewage treatment plant, except my sewage treatment plant has a finite capacity. So if I go over that finite capacity, I have to dump that water. And so you have a sewage outflow that allows that now diluted sewage to go into the lake.
And with the increased rainfall and global warming, that problem.
That is the problem, and Syracuse right now is trying to figure out how to go to a separate sanitary and storm sewers. Now, there are some things that you can do. I mean, that's an expensive proposition. I'm not going to be into that, but that's very. But this is where you get into the idea. Okay, all right. The problem is not that they're combined. I mean, that's a problem. But the real problem is the water down there is more than my sewage treatment plant can handle. So I could build a bigger sewage treatment plant. I could build a holding basin to hold that and release it into the sewage treatment plant. Or I could reduce the water going into that system with rainwater. And this is where you get into these save the rain. The first two are engineering solutions. If you like engineering solutions, go for it. They're expensive, but I mean, they work. The third one is the green infrastructure. Put in porous pavement, so all that water that hits on the parking lot doesn't run off into the storm sewer, but soaks down into the ground. Now, will it end up in the storm sewer? Yeah, eventually, but the idea is to delay it long enough so it comes in over a long period of treatment so that your sewage treatment plant can do that. Put in bioswales, put in rain gardens, right? And any individual one probably doesn't make much impact, but when you start doing lots of them, you can capture a whole bunch of water. I mean, the Forestry School has now put in these underwater, I don't know what you want to call it, we call them suburban wetlands, basically, but basically underwater porous sponges that the rainwater off all the building goes in there and it gets released and comes back along. But these are the things you can do at the individual level or at the municipal level. I mean, no new development, in my mind, my total biased opinion, no new development should be allowed to put in a parking lot that doesn't have porous pavement. Porous pavement nowadays is so cheap, it's not that expensive, it lasts as long as regular pavement. Right? It just should be a given that you do these little types of things. Right? Yeah.
There's two dynamic processes that in this lake that are now currently being evaluated, and some would say under siege. One would be the introduction of herbicides, and my question to you would be on your scientific level as to whether or not herbicides either decrease or add to harmful algae blooms. The second one is the process of ongoing weed cutting over the years, which basically serves like a lawnmower, cutting the Arabian milfoil and a few of the other so-called native weeds, which ultimately end up either in the lake or on the surface of the lake, then floating to the shoreline, which all in the long run, as we know, add to the phosphorus applications. So whether or not we have the bottom-up or top-down eutrophication process in terms of this lake management, I don't think that's really been settled here yet at all.
All right, so let's do the easier one of the two, which is the weed cutting. So here's what we know. Blue-green algae will grow just fine on mulched up weeds. So if you chop up all of these weeds, you will give them a source of nutrients that they will grow on. No problem there. However, if you already have a fair amount of nutrients in your lake, which you do, right? Then the blue-green algae don't need the nutrients in the weeds. So in that particular case, if you can collect those weeds will suck up phosphorus and take those weeds out of, I want to call it the watershed, but out of the drain shed, right? So that they remove that phosphorus out, then that can actually be a significant removal of phosphorus from the lake. So Whether that is beneficial or detrimental really depends on what's happening in your lake. At a local level, and we saw this in Soda Bay all the time, if you go out and you collect the plants that are off your property and you stick them on your shoreline to rot, all the phosphorus that was in that plant comes right back down into the lake, and you have done nothing for your lake. If you put them in a wheelbarrow and get them 50 feet away from the shore, when they rot, out of that 50-foot zone, those nutrients will go down in the soil, and you can actually, it's a minor spot, it's a minor amount, but you actually are removing phosphorus. There are people like in Wayne County Soil and Water Conservation District there that actually track their tonnage of weeds that they move, and they track their phosphorus that they are removing out into the watershed. And in their particular case, the farmers are happy to have it. I mean, it's a good source of nutrients for their farm fields, right? And so they look at it as a beneficial, but it is true, the algae will grow on the mulch, so you do really want to get the weeds out.
So what about the second and the first?
The first one? Oh, damn. Okay. Herbicides. All right. Herbicides are, again, there's not a straightforward answer. So if you have a lake like the South Basin, where you have a relatively shallow lake and you have a fairly strong wind fetch, then one of the main things that's keeping that sediment down on the lake is those plants. And if you go in with herbicides and you kill those plants, then you're going to increase the resuspension of the internal load of the phosphorus off there. And there are numerous examples where that actually has happened. But it usually only happens in very shallow wind-fetched lakes. Right? If you have a deeper lake, then what we usually see in those particular cases is the plants are growing up, they're taking phosphorus out of the soil, but in a deeper lake that phosphorus probably wasn't available to the algae anyway, right? The plants are dying and releasing the phosphorus back, but they're dying and releasing the phosphorus back in the fall when it's too cold for the algae to grow, so that's not really impacting anyway. And so in many of those cases, you go in with an herbicide and you really don't see a major regime shift. You don't see a big impact. And so if you go into the literature, you'll see some examples that say, man, this caused blooms. You'll see other samples that say, this had no impact on blooms. I have never seen an example where using herbicide got rid of the blooms, right? So it's either neutral or worse.
Can I follow?
Sure.
Most lakes have stratification levels.
Yep.
This lake, in my opinion, has none of that because of the shallowness of it.
South Basin absolutely does not.
And of course, because it's basically a 20-foot at best level, which indicates to me that the eutrophication process has both started at the top and continues to the bottom. And you have really no biological oxygenation levels at all that support game fish to certain levels. And then we get to another part of the lake which may have a very small stratification assessed to it, and therefore it's going to be very difficult to manage that under a specific program of maintenance or improvement.
So if you look at it back on this graph, this is the South Basin, they're just looking at the total phosphorus. Clearly there's no stratification on this lake. So what happens is, as the lake goes through the season, the sun shines down, it warms up the upper water. That upper water is lighter than the cold water, so the lake stratifies and you get an upper warm water lens and a deep cold dark water lens. Or, well, it's not dark, it is dark because it's deep. And you get what's called a thermocline, a layer where the temperature makes this sharp differential thing. Well, what happens on that layer is things don't go between that layer very well. And so the algae are growing up in the upper waters and stuff like that, and they're using all the phosphorus up in the upper water. But the phosphorus down in that bottom water can't get up. And so what you see is these cases is the phosphorus down in the bottom water sits down there. What makes it even worse is the algae in the upper water, when they die,
they tend to settle down into the dark waters. When they get decomposed, they cause those dark waters to go anoxic, and as the waters go anoxic, the sediments release phosphorus about 20 times faster. Now, this is a rate. Remember, it's 20 times faster when it's anoxic. If you're in the South Basin, you don't have to go anoxic. You have so much phosphorus sediment respinded up there that you just say, okay, I'll pay the 20 times cost because I still have enough phosphorus coming off my sediments. I don't have to worry about it, right? But this is where we talk about anoxic release of phosphorus, right? It is much faster. Eventually, end of the year, top water gets colder, the bottom water now is warmer than the top water, and the whole thing flips over, and this is what's called turnover. The whole lake flips over, all that phosphorus in the bottom gets flung up into the top, but you're hoping that it's cold, so the algae can't grow at that point in time. The ice comes in, right? When we were talking about this at dinner, we didn't actually know the answer to this. Many lakes, especially lakes that have a strong wind fetch, the thermocline sets up, but it doesn't set up strong enough to stay throughout the whole summer. So you get like this, and then it flips, and it flips, and it flips, and you get what's called a nutrient pump, where you get this phosphorus coming out of the bottom, it's higher, and then it gets flipped up, and then it does like that, right? And so in those cases, you have to worry about that type of thing. That's very dependent upon the shape of your lake, and it's very dependent upon the winds that year. Like that. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it's what I thought.
Yeah.
South Basin, the weighted out scenario, I've heard numbers from 25 to 100 years to wait it out.
How long did it take you to get it polluted?
I don't know, it seems to get worse the last 30 years.
All right, then I'll pick 30 years. No, I mean, honestly, so one of the problems with the South Basin, let's see, what are yours? Let's go. Where did I start? All right, one of the problems with the South Basin is that, right? You're connected to the North Basin. So if you don't fix the problem in the North Basin is constantly providing
The
stuff.
outlet is Chautauqua River, the outlet flows all that way, and the wind blows it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
The drain is the drain.
That's taken into account of these models. So they figured out how much comes in and how much goes out. And so
And
those
all the
models,
sediment from the north flows down to the
yeah,
south.
all the sediment from the north flows down. So it's very interesting if you actually read where the North Basin, they talk about a target of 20 is your target value for micrograms phosphorus. But the South Basin, your target is 17 because they figured you have this certain percentage coming in from the North Basin that even at 20, it's still going to be bringing in 3. So you're going to have to get the South Basin low. Now, one of the big problems with this TMDL, and I don't know if there's anybody here that was involved in the TMDL, you can correct me. I will happily be corrected. But when they started looking at these load allocations, where they wanted their loads to be, they magically took this internal load and they said, it's gone away. We set it to 100% reduction. And I looked at that and I said, ooh, I really want to see how they're going to do that because I don't know how you would accomplish that. And I don't know if that was something in their model that just they didn't explain in their TMDL or something. But anyway, like I say, TMDLs are always guesses. You know, there are approximations on approximations, right? But they're quite useful because it allows you to sort of say, okay, my best guess is, you know, how much impact, for example, if I were to try to kill the internal load here with alum, would it have an impact on the North Basin? Probably not, right? Would it have an impact on the South Basin? Well, it would if alum worked on a shallow wind-driven site, but it probably isn't going to work there either. So anyway, the answer to your question is it's very hard to predict
how long it's going to be. If you were to be able to shut it off 100%, right, it will be a lot faster, right? The few cases where they have shut external loads off 100%, they've seen recoveries on ours of the foot of 5 years, but it also depends on how big that internal load is. I can tell you Honeywell right now is probably totally driven off of its internal load. They've really done a great job on the external loads.
So are you saying then that there should be a tax surcharge on the north facing properties to make it around?
I don't live in the county, so I can say no, but I mean, this is where you're talking about spreading the pain around, and that crazy three-arm balance is that where you see the benefit is not necessarily who pays the price, right? Because a lot of these things, you know, they're not immediate, like I say, oh, geesh, you know, if I plant cover crop, right, I can feed it to my cows. I mean, that's a benefit that I see the benefit right there, right? I make the investment, it's a good thing for the environment, but I also see a return, right?
In that regard, one last thing, and I'm shut. The tradition and the custom in the county seems to be to roll your lawns in the spring. The rollers will have their tractors and so forth. What we should be doing is aerating, so that we get more infiltration and less surface runoff. Infiltration is not, aeration is not very expensive. How would you feel about a tax credit for people who aerate their lawns in proximity to measure the thing?
I live in a place where the groundskeeper for they're no longer the Syracuse Chiefs baseball team, now the New York Mets baseball team is my next door neighbor. And so he diligently looks at my lawn every day and comes through and gives me little hints what I'm supposed to do. So I now own the little aeration shoes that you walk around when you mow the lawn and they aerate your lawn. And I have the little aerate roller and stuff like that. So you know, you're absolutely right. For your health of your lawn, right, and to promote infiltration, we should all be aerating. But we don't, because it's a pain and it's a lot of work to do it. So I don't know. Maybe you get a community together and you say, hey, look, these aerators cost like, the rolling aerators cost maybe $70.
If I
I'm going to get
aerate my lawn, it's $150.
Yeah.
If I subtract $150 from my tax bill, it still leaves some burden.
Well, and then if you were my wife, she would say, well, why do you have a lawn to start with? Why don't you just plant ground cover?
Right, because if I go to sell the house, it takes it right off the top of the resale value.
Yeah. Well, now we're talking about the environmental benefit versus who's paying the cost. Yeah. No, I mean, aeration of the lawn's a great thing. I can't say anything but positive, but it's a pain in the ass to do. Yeah.
How much in a situation like the Southern Basin, which is very shallow, much of it is 6 feet or less in depth, you can see on aerial photographs where you can see propeller marks from the turbulence of propellers in the sediment. How much of that is wind-driven versus motor-driven, the phosphorus release?
Well, if you look at aerial photographs and you see the whole lake is mixed up, that's wind-driven. And if you see the boat tracks going through, that's probably propeller-driven. No, I mean, really, honestly, the serious answer, if you have a shallow lake with a lot of boat traffic in a shallow lake, it will cause a significant amount of sediment resuspension.
And so much of that area, though, is so badly weeded and algae that you can't even run boats through it anymore.
Well, in some ways, that's actually good for the lake because it's keeping the sediment down there and keeping the crops out, but it's terrible for the fishermen. So now you're talking about this stupid balance of, do I want to balance the benefits of the lake and give up the societal aspects of fishing? And this is, every BMP you do is a balance. Somebody wins and somebody loses. Hopefully the lake wins, and then hopefully somebody is willing to pay for it.
Water skiing and pleasure boating.
That's a societal balance. That's a thing. Yeah.
Might you be testing the areas that were treated this past year
I going to be testing the areas treated with herbicide? I am not planning on testing the areas treated
The phosphorus.
for phosphorus. Yeah, for phosphorus. If anybody wanted to collect a sample and send it to us, we would run it. It's not hard.
For sure, you should be testing for sure. The Stowe, Venus Point region in there, it's heavily developed. There's only sewer on one side too. That's, the North Basin Salt, they have sewer.
No. It's your lake.
Yeah, okay, well.
You should be testing. I live in Syracuse. No, I mean, there are people that will run the tests. So, I mean, you have lake associations that do this. This is not hard to do. Yeah, back here. Be very patient.
Just a curiosity on my part. What would be better for a yard around the lake? I know you have the barrier, that's great. I totally agree with that. But would it be better instead of having a monocrop of grass, everybody thinks they have to have, which is ridiculous in my opinion, or just let it grow the weeds and everything else that's natural in a yard? Which would be better for the lake?
I have this 3-arm balance, all right? Within that buffer strip of the lake, I say for the lake, I would say put grass. I would get my lake association to give out a little lake award for the cleanest, fanciest buffer strip that has little, totem poles and gazebos and sculptures and make it really fun. And that's the area I'm really concerned with on the lake. Once you get up into the headlands, assuming that you have aerated grass, there is a societal value in there. I like playing croquet, and I like chipping with my golf clubs. And I get way too much practice in the deep grass when I play golf. So I would much rather have grass in my house. Right? So I think, I like grass. And I think if done correctly, grass is not a bad thing. Running grass down to the edge of the lake is not doing it correctly.
So you don't think even the wild weeds that grow in the yard naturally, your dandelions, your plantain, and all the others, that would not give a benefit
To the lake? Yeah, probably would. Is it that much benefit to the lake that it overcomes the decrease in property values by having a neighbor who looks like terrible? I don't know. Sorry, I think you have wild weeds, but my neighbor has wild weeds, and I hear it from my wife every single night. We're building a fence. We're building a fence. I'm tired of these weeds. Yeah. It's hard to say. Like I say, once you move off that 50-foot buffer strip and you get into the uplands, the key thing is you want that water to infiltrate in the ground, and you don't want it to just run off in there. So maybe you build a little bioswale and you put some, natural grasses in a rain garden. Right? I'm all for rain gardens. I like rain gardens. They're pretty.
Would it be important that that last 50 feet or a good portion of that 50 feet was level as opposed to being sloped? I'm describing my lakefront. Down, very steep steps from the street, and as soon as you get to the bottom, it is absolute level for probably 40 feet to boulders. There's no slope at all.
And where's your water level on that level? Is the 40 feet underwater?
Yes.
Well, if it's underwater, then it's not considered lakeshore.
Not underwater. No, actually, it's the highest in the neighborhood because it doesn't slope. Somehow, it was probably built up by a prior owner. So it's boulders and rocks that are probably 4 feet above the lake level. And if you walk toward the stairs, which are 40 feet away to look at the street, it's level. There's no slope to the lake at all, which I would think would be a good thing.
I think that's a good thing, yeah. A lot of it depends, when you talk about groundwater flow, a lot of it depends on what's under the ground. Is it perforating down through the whole level? Is there like some type of shale level and it goes down and then it scoots along? You know, because if you were to drill down through your yard, you would find that it's not porous soil all the way down. You go down and you start to hit rocks and stuff like that. The water does the same thing. It goes down to there and it just shoots off. So depending on where the groundwater goes, I mean, mostly the idea is that if you're in ground, right, 40 or 50 feet, right, is enough to suck up all the nutrients. Anybody here have shore wells? Shore wells in this neck of the woods?
Explain that.
Shore well is where you get your drinking water by drilling a 10-foot hole on the shore, and you put that shore well 50 feet away from the shore, and then you just allow the groundwater to infiltrate in, and that will clear up all the pollutants in your lake, and you can take that out and use that as your drinking water. Very standard for a lot of lake associations. Also, by the way, a water treatment plant in the city of Berlin in Germany. They use shore wells. They just put a 50-foot bank along the side of the Rhine River, and that's their purification. Very effective, but anyway, it's the same type of thing. If you get that filtering through that certain amount of soil, right, it's pretty good at catching whatever it is.
Seems to me like that buffer, 50-foot buffer, that could be very beautiful. I mean, it could be an improvement to your property. So this question maybe John can answer better than you, specifically about Chautauqua Lake. I'm wondering if there is some sort of initiative or some sort of educational outreach to property owners around the lake, farmers specifically, to encourage planting a buffer zone. And if there is, how effective has it been? Has it been received well?
For residential owners around Chautauqua Lake, probably 25% of people have buffers now, which is a pretty big improvement over 10 years ago. And there's Conservancy constantly encourages people to do shoreland buffers. Most people don't have them 50 feet wide. Most people it's 5 feet or 10 feet, but it's better than
Every bit helps.
around the water line because that protects your shoreline from eroding when you have high water like we have right now. I would ask the Soil and Water District to comment on how successful they've been with agricultural buffers.
There's programs through the federal government, through NRCS for buffers. They've been existing for a while. I can't think of, I know there's some that went into Chautauqua Lake when there was a special initiative for Chautauqua Lake a couple years ago. But the state is now going to have a program for source water protection and ag buffers in those areas. So that would be the north basin of Chautauqua Lake. That hasn't rolled out yet. I think it was part of the whole halves and everything else that money's filtering down through. But that's something that the districts can get money for. And we're already kind of planning with the Watershed Conservancy how we can set up Chautauqua Lake to be eligible or areas that we can use that for and be ready to go when they do roll it out, whenever that may be. And it also, like, homeowners on the watershed on stream banks also can plant buffers too and have an impact. It's not just strictly, oh, it's an ag land. I mean, we go out to a lot of landowner properties on the streams that they have erosion and it's lawn to eroding into the stream, and a buffer can benefit them just as much as an ag field.
The picture here where you're talking about beautiful benefits, right? This is an example of a buffer strip. There's a fantastic book that's called Landscaping for Wildlife and Water Quality. You can get it through NYSFOA, the New York Federation of Lake Association. It's done by Minnesota Sea Grant or somebody there. I have a copy in my car because I meant to bring it in just to show you. But it talks all about how to make, first of all, how to do it right? Because there is a little bit of learning curve there. And then how to make it really pretty and what type of plants to plant. And if you want to get, I don't know if you guys want deer in your neighborhood, but if you want deer, how to get plants. If you don't want deer, what to plant, and all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot of, this is actually one place where the web is really good. If you just type in, landscaping for water quality, there are a tremendous number of really good resources that have really great ideas. And you just pick the one that you say, oh, hey, I kind of like that one. It's
kind of like paint my house green. I like that color. You know, not that it's better than blue, but I like that color. Other questions? Yeah.
A comment and then a question. I think we need a culture shift, and I think we're in the process of that as far as what is beautiful, what is functional. Those buffers are good for pollinators; they can be beautiful, and a manicured lawn is a monoculture that some people might like, and there might be a place for it. But we need to help people understand that those buffers are really, really important along all the waterways. And I'm a biologist, so I'm a little biased on that. But my second piece of this was you had mentioned Onondaga and said that there was a 3-step process that really was apparently really successful in reducing the phosphorus. And I think you mentioned the first was sewering. I can't remember.
It was.
What were the other steps?
It was all. So you have to understand that when Onondaga Lake started, the septic system was basically designed in the 1950s. It was the only septic system, certainly in North America and probably in the world, where the sewer system discharged to a lake where there was no other input of water. So the sewer system was 90% of the water coming into the lake. So under those circumstances, the normal calculations of I could release, 1,000 micrograms into this lake really didn't apply. And so they only had primary and secondary treatment. And it was like, we need to take this thing up to tertiary treatment. So the first stage was to go all the way up to tertiary treatment. And then the next stage was to say, I'm sorry, but in this case, tertiary treatment is not good enough, so we're going to go to ActiFlow. So they went to the new ActiFlow treatments for phosphorus removal. And then they said, okay, now we've got a handle on phosphorus. Let's start to go after ammonia and nitrogen. And so they went into ammonia denitrifiers and remove all the ammonia, because they had an ammonia problem also there. So they had not only anoxic. They also, just one of the interesting things, Syracuse is a fascinating place for the Onondaga, because they also have a minor problem with mercury. AKA Allied Chemical dumped 22 tons of mercury into the lake. Right? So one of the interesting things is they've taken, and this is very controversial, but they've taken the approach of dredging up that mercury is actually going to be more detrimental than just allowing it to bury and settle down in the pavement, right? And so not everybody agrees with that, but that was their choice. But one of the interesting problems is that when they went to the ActiFlow system and the nitrogen removal, and they got rid of all this nitrate, it's what I call the law of unexpected consequences. What they didn't think about is they changed the redox chemistry of the lake by not having any nitrate there, and all the mercury bacteria now, sulfur bacteria, started releasing mercury up into the water column. So they had to actually go back to their sewage treatment plant and say, look, you're too clean. We need to actually put nitrate into the lake to control mercury level. Right. And so it's a fact, and they're one of the few places in the world that is actually doing that successfully now. So it's a really fascinating study of how you play these things off against each other and stuff like that. Yeah.
How did Syracuse pay for that?
Through the nose. So there were basically 3 sources of funding. First of all, with the mercury and everything else, it is actually an EPA Superfund site. So they do have Superfund money that helps clean that up. Second is they got a judgment decree against what was then Allied Chemical, and Allied Chemical got sold out to Honeywell, and so Honeywell has invested a huge amount of money in the cleanup. Now, both of those were through primarily dealing with the mercury and the pollution and a few other issues there. Right? The actual sewage treatment plants itself was paid for by the county, the state, with matching money from the feds. So they got their legislative arm together and basically said, look, we have a lake. We are one of the few urban lakes where we actually own 90% of the shoreline of this lake, and we can't use it for a park. And the problem is us. Right? And so they did pull it. It was very controversial. I mean, there are a lot of people that said that, you know, it was not worth doing that. But, you know, we now have a $100 million mall sitting on the side, you know. We have recreational trails that go all the way around the lake. You know, it's become quite the destination spot. You know, it is the busiest park in the county. It's to go to the lake. Yeah.
Can you comment on the herbicides, Navigate 2,4-D and Aquafol Super K, effectiveness of short-term monitoring?
Effectiveness, if done correctly, they are considered very effective for submerged aquatic plant control. I don't think there's a lot of controversy about that. The question is, what are the unintended consequences that come about from controlling those aquatic plants? I mean, I know there was a lot of worry here about them getting into the drinking water. Again, that depends on where the water intakes are. It depends on where the herbicides are and how fast, you know, the flushing rate of the water goes through. Those herbicides don't, my understanding is they don't stay around in the water column for a tremendously long period of time. So it's sort of a short-term application. You kill the plants, and then after 2 weeks, we're back. But I'm not a herbicide person, so I'm not be the right person to make anything more about it. Yeah?
Do we have a plan for Chautauqua Lake to reduce the phosphorus? And I haven't heard about just individuals or countywide.
Well, the lake management plan has all sorts of priority areas. It goes to creeks and says these are creeks that to do this. I'm sure the Soil and Water Conservation District probably has a list, right, of hot spots that they want to work on.
When we first got the TMDL, was it 2012?
Yes. Yeah, TMDL is 2012.
So I think it was probably 2013, 14, and 15. The legislature did, there's in the TMDL there's recommendations for each like of the subcategories. So the Water Quality Task Force for the county put together an update every year. I think we did for about 3 years, and I was kind of like, it's the same thing. We're just kind of continuing all these same projects. But we kind of touched on like the wastewater treatment plants got upgrades. I don't know details about that because that's not my thing. But like we do different things with agriculture, the hydro seeding and the routine road maintenance. Like that's different things in that TMDL that people are addressing. I mean that was made public to the legislature. We're not really broadcasting out, but it is something that we have. I think it's up in 2015. That was last year. Just because the legislature didn't ask anymore, it's kind of like the same thing. They're doing the same thing that's under updates, but.
I know the management plan identifies specific creeks and specific things that need to be done, targets in those creeks. This is the 2010 management plan that came out before. It's really nice on that. But it doesn't go back and say, you know, Farmer Smith needs to fix his agricultural field and put fences up because his cows are walking into the creek bed. You know, and those are the things that the soil and water knows about.
And that's the thing with the TMDL too, when he says they're all estimations of everything. But all those are based on no best management practices at all. No best management practices in stormwater, developed lands, none in ag. So like, some of them have been around since the 40s. So like, we've been doing best management practices in ag for a long time. But all those calculations don't consider that because it's so localized and then we hard to make a number. And so it's better to generalize. They're telling you the general area that you can impact.
Yeah, so the way they do these, they run what's called a bathtub model. You measure the phosphorus that's coming in from the creeks, the amount of water that's coming in, you measure the phosphorus that's going
out, measure the water that evaporates, you can calculate all those things. And then you figure out the change in concentration in your lake and things like that. And then you start to say, okay, well, I have this much phosphorus. I go in, I look at elevation, I look at rainfall, this much should be coming off. So you get a pretty good idea about the total amount of phosphorus. The percentages, she's absolutely right. They could be horribly far off. We could call them away. Right? Those of you who know the way.
Well, I think with that, we need to close this up in deference to the library staff. Thank all of you for coming tonight, and really appreciate Dr. Boyer coming down here from Syracuse. And